life doesn't take place on the summit. Really, life takes place on the flanks of the mountain, on the sides of the mountain, and that's where you learn. That's where you make mistakes, and you brush yourself off, and you re-engage and reestablish and re-educate and realign.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Talent Playbook Podcast. My name is Jason Ferrara. I'm the Chief Marketing and Strategy Officer at Outmatch and your host for the podcast. Our podcast focuses on strategies for transforming your world of work. During each podcast, we highlight someone who's transformed their organization or industry in a significant way. Today's guest is Jeff Evans. Jeff is the author of the book Mountain Vision: Lessons Beyond the Summit. His bio is incredibly diverse and exciting. I'll let him dig into that during the podcast. I'll introduce him using the terms he uses: adventurer, expedition leader, speaker and facilitator, TV personality, and physician's assistant and high-altitude medic. That's quite a list of jobs. He does them all. He does them all really well, and he tells some great stories about them. I originally met Jeff a few weeks ago in Colorado and was completely blown away by his experience, his ability to communicate, his compassion, his toughness, and most of all, how he puts his experience together into leadership and life lessons. Jeff is not an HR practitioner, but like the best HR practitioners, he has deep experience in the field, working with people, building teams, taking risks, and learning from them. I'm excited to have you hear about Jeff's views on risk-taking, what being a guide really means, how he's adopted a way of life that he calls the Sherpa attitude, using the concept of VUCA to prepare your life and business, and his advice for people starting their careers. I'm sure you'll enjoy the conversation with Jeff, so without further delay, here's the Talent Playbook Podcast with Jeff Evans. Jeff, thanks for joining the podcast today. Really excited to have you here. We met a couple of weeks ago and really spent some great time with you. I wanted to redo some of those questions that we asked a few weeks ago and just talk a little bit about your experience and your professional experience, your leadership experience, and just try to tease out some of that stuff in today's podcast. So really, thanks for joining us. Very excited to have you here.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, it's a good dovetail off the time that I got to spend with the group a few weeks ago in Dale. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Great. So I think the best way to start here is to have you describe your job and talk a little bit about how long you've been doing that job.
Well, that's kind of a loaded question. So I have a few jobs, and I feel like I've always had a few jobs. I've never really, I feel like I've got sort of constructive or deconstructive ADD. I'm not sure which one it is. I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm pretty restless. I have been since I can remember. And, maybe it was a good omen, because, that restlessness is what really sort of pushed me to sort of try new things and do new things and really not settle. So, I've always been fascinated with medicine since I was itty bitty and growing up, and I remember watching that show called Emergency back in the day and loving those LA paramedic dudes. Those guys kind of planted the seed for me. And so medicine was always something I figured that I would do. And then, my aspirations for medicine just kind of got interrupted by mountaineering and climbing. And so at some point I wed those two things, and, I went on to go to physician assistant school and became a PA about 18 years ago. And before that was an EMT and had done a fair bit of, emergency room tech work. And then the PA work, has always been focused on the emergency room and trauma settings. But then all the while allowing my climbing to stay sort of, front and center, I chose to go to PA school. One of the main reasons was so that I could get in and get out and get back to climbing and being outside, as opposed to, looking at 8 years of indentured servitude to be a doc. So the PA route made sense. And then, sort of kept climbing and the climbing and the medicine blended together at some point. And, I ended up being, the expedition doc on most of, all the trips for the past 20 years that I've been on, and sort of focused my attention on altitude physiology and travel medicine, and still kept my hands in the trauma game. And so, those two careers have kind of gone hand in hand, together through the years. And then about right when we got back from Everest in 2001, I got asked to do a speaking event, and the speaking event was terrible. It was nerve wracking. It was crappy. I was nervous and I hated every second of it. And that was that was 17 years ago. And since then I've loved speaking to groups now. I really enjoy it. And I love the opportunity and the honor to have the attention of folks and being able to share stories with them. And then my main job with that is to distill down the messages and the themes that are applicable to all of us, that, personally and professionally, from these experiences that I've had. And I enjoy that process too, is the sort of unweaving the fabric a little bit and looking inside of those experiences to determine what I've learned and where I could be the better version of me. And so there you go. Those are my sort of 3 careers, along with being an author, and writing a book. And I'm actually currently writing my 2nd book right now. And so, and then I'm a husband and a father. I guess that's a full-time job as well. Yeah, so that's the up to speed right there.
So, are you looking for more to do? Do you have enough to do? I guess is the question.
Do I have enough to do? I don't really know if I have a good answer to that. I think that, as I'm aging, I'm still curious and hungry, but I'm not as restless as I used to be. I guess I'll frame it that way. Mm-hmm. I'm not as crazy restless. I'm happy sitting, in I have a couple acres of property up in Evergreen, and man, I'm getting good at being an old guy now. I love sitting in my rocking chair and just watching, wildlife around in the back meadow behind my property, So the restlessness has abated a little bit, but the curiosity and the hunger has not. So I guess that's a sort of a loaded way to answer your question there.
That's great. That's great. So let's talk about climbing quickly, because you talked a little bit about how medicine had always been in your blood and had been a fascination of yours. I remember sitting around my grandma's house watching Emergency when I was a kid too. So, must mean that was aired on Wednesday nights. That's when we were over at her house. So, I totally get that. I totally see that. Where did the fascination and the love of climbing and mountaineering come from?
That was sort of, I think, birthed from that restlessness, right? So I grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina and Virginia, and none of my family were outdoorsy at all, like the opposite. Mm-hmm. And when we didn't have a whole lot of resources, and, very low middle class, and so we didn't get out a lot. Dad was working his butt off just to take care of us, and mm-hmm. so I was just climbing trees and rocks, and those trees and rocks just became not big enough for me. So that hunger that I've spoken about, that really took me to Colorado eventually. And mm-hmm. I just packed up my bag and moved out. Then the Colorado Rockies really were my playground for years, and allowed me to learn about how to stay comfortable and how to stay sharp and how to take care of people in the mountains. And then that sort of burgeoned into, I ended up meeting, this blind guy named Eric. And then, Eric and I started to do a lot of things together, a lot of objectives, a lot of shared objectives. And, that took us all over the world and, on the biggest mountains in the world and biggest rock faces in the world. And that relationship, sort of, grew to allow us to continue to try hard things. And so at that point, there was no return. I was in it to win it, and climbing became my life.
What a great backyard to have, being in the Rockies. So you've mentioned Everest, you mentioned Eric, and I definitely want to get into that. But first I want to talk a little bit about, I'm sure the challenges of climbing Everest are incredibly detailed. But as the Rockies is your backyard, were the lessons that you learned there things you took with you to other challenges? Where was sort of the proving ground of your success? Was it in the Rockies, and were there specific times you looked at it and said, boy, that I need to remember this moment for taking it on to something else or to bigger things?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's obviously a combination of anything. I think to be good at anything, no matter what the medium is, it's critical to do an apprenticeship, right? And to come up short and to make these mistakes. And that's why I use that whole metaphor you might remember, from our talk was, that life doesn't take place on the summit.
Right.
We have this tendency to think of it that way, but really life takes place on the flanks of the mountain, on the sides of the mountain. And that's where you learn. That's where you make mistakes and you brush yourself off and you re-engage and reestablish and re-educate and realign and do these things again, so that when you do have those precious moments, those precious summits, that you're, as good as you can possibly be. So, I think a lot of my apprenticeship took place in Colorado, but there was where I went to school was in Alaska. And my first trip up to Alaska was with Eric in 94, I think, 94, 95. And I was just as green as I could be, and I was all of a sudden in the Alaska range. And that was an eye opener, about how to really climb and how to move and take care of yourself and take care of other people. And so as a result, I ended up spending 5 seasons in Alaska, on Denali. I guided expeditions on Denali, as well as worked for the Park Service and did search and rescue on Denali for 2 seasons. And oftentimes I'd do them back to back. I'd do a month of search and rescue and then a month of an expedition. So that was my life for a while. And the Alaska range taught me how to knuckle down and take it on the chin, as well as just how to interface with clients and patience. And so I really give Alaska a lot of credit for me, teaching me all these hard skills and soft skills necessary to take care of people. So I think it was those fledgling years, the combination of Colorado and Alaska, really taught me a lot.
So I think it's easy to hear you say, we climbed Everest, we climbed Denali, and I know that there are risks inherent in that. I just, after talking with you and reading your book, the risks are for someone who doesn't climb like me, and the risks are incredible. Just even your description of getting the plane from the staging town to the base of Denali is like a hair-raising plane ride just to get through the gap.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about just risk taking in general. What about what risks? How do you decide what risk is worth it? How do you decide when if fear takes over and you choose not to risk something? Talk a little bit about risk and your perception of that.
Yeah, and that's a very complex sort of, I would even call it like a behavior, the way you react to risk, because we all react differently to it. And so in a way, I think it's a behavior because it's how you as an individual manifest your reaction to consequence versus risk. And I find those two things very interesting. It's, the idea of consequence versus risk, because, the consequences, in a way can increase and be more profound, at certain stages in the journey, but the risk is always there. And, the risk for me has evolved. The consequences are, they change. They move, what am I looking at as far as, flying around in a helicopter doing search and rescue on Everest or Denali, and, the consequences are severe. The risk is high, but the risk is probably different from a perception than it is in reality.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I've had to give a lot of that thought. Now, that being said, I'm very curious about this topic and how we all react to risk and consequence. And it all changes, I think, as we age and we become more, we balance this sort of quiver that we've acquired of skill sets. Because as we age, we get better at what we do. We have more experience, more wisdom, and more talent, I would think. And we understand sort of how to navigate through this gauntlet of challenges that we face professionally and personally. But then we have, then we also have to balance that out with the fact that, yep, we're older now.
Yeah.
So with regard to climbing, like, I have to understand my limitations. And, I had a kid 13 years ago. And my level of acceptable risk changed significantly when my son was born.
Yeah.
Because prior to his birth, I was charging. And when I was in my 20s, I was pretty confident I wouldn't make it through my, into my 30s. And then all of a sudden I'm like, I'm in my 30s now. Oh, okay. Oh, and then wait, I'm married. Oh, wait. And now we're going to have a kid. Wait, what? So, it's like the whole optic of risk and challenge and consequence all sort of kind of clumped together. That being said, I'm wired a certain way, and my wife knows it. My son knows it. That I would be really unhappy if I didn't do things that were hard. They know that about me, and so when I go off now, I guess the metric for safety is different. So now I haven't been climbing, big 8,000 meter peaks. I've been climbing 6,000 meter peaks, right? And I've been, I flew around in helicopters on Everest for 2 months, just a couple of years ago, doing search and rescue. And, that's pretty dangerous flying around in the Himalaya in a helicopter, at really high elevations in questionable weather. And as a matter of fact, one of the pilots I did a lot of missions with just crashed his helicopter and died about 2 months ago. So it happens, and it happens. So that's sort of an extension of this risk. And then, just last year, I was asked to go lead a team in Iraq, a medical team in Mosul, as the Iraqi special operations groups were pushing through to eradicate ISIS out of Mosul. And so I went and I spent a month there, and we got attacked by ISIS, and they came shooting us and dropping RPGs on us. And it was a big mess. But that's another level of risk that I never would have forecasted, but it exists. And so I think my family knows that, I do these things because I'm hungry for adventure and I want to do, challenging things, but I also owe it to them to do my best to not be careless. And so I try to evaluate my, sort of my entire, my reasoning for these missions that I take on, and make sure that they're valuable and they're worthy. And then it's not just a reckless sort of, I just want to go out and just see how much, crap I can stir up.
Right.
That would be reckless, and that would be selfish to my wife and my son. So it's all changed, and it continues to change. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, it reminds me of the one story in the book where you and your team are standing, on the mountain, and, essentially in a blizzard. You're like 90 minutes from summiting, and your partner comes up with the phrase, getting to the summit is optional, but going home is not, right? So there's you have to bring this realism to it at some point, or at least you can take risks but not be careless. I like that phrase a lot.
Right. Yeah. And that's it. And, it's back in the day, it was different. And, I was hanging out with a lot of hard chargers, and I still am. It's just all of us hard chargers have now aged, and our spectrum has changed, right, which is a good thing. Yeah.
So one of the things I think you're particularly good at is taking these experiences and bringing them to people who don't have the same climbing experience, but making them relevant. So around this concept of risk, I'd love to, in the business that we do, if I make a mistake, nobody dies, right? And in fact, in most businesses that I know of, mistakes, they're not life or death things. So help us understand a little bit about, you've been through risks and situations that are life and death situations. How do you make those things relevant to your audience when you're talking to them?
Well, that's the goal with my speaking career, right? To make these experiences less about the mountains and less about these things that I've done. That's just the storyline. That's just to capture the attention and to create an engaging storyline that it's there. It's like, wow, okay, so whoa, I can see this picture. I can see this scenario, right? And so I paint that picture, but then the fun and I think really challenging and fun thing for me is to reflect on those experiences and take those themes and messages from those experiences and make them global, make them very a very comprehensive learning opportunity, so that it's you're taking away from the theater and putting it right there in the kitchen, and saying, I don't care what you do. I don't care what your background. I don't care where you operate, what your experiences are, but these themes of being a guide, with the people around you, leading them from this place of service and thinking about other people first, and acknowledging adversity when it slaps you in the face, and manifesting in an appropriate way for the people around you, and communicating effectively and transparently with your family, your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, the people in your church, your kids' Boy Scout group,
right,
whatever. And that's it. Once I really sat down and reflected on all these things and realized it's such crossover, and it was this complete cross-pollination to everything that we all go through, it made the whole thing really very palatable, I think, and fun. And so that's my job, is to set the table so that, a person who's spent their entire life in Des Moines, Iowa, and has never really even seen a mountain can then ultimately relate to the experiences, because it's not about the mountains.
Yeah.
So that's the fun part and for me, and I really enjoy that aspect of this whole thing as well.
Thanks for that. I have a couple of very specific questions about some of the lessons that we've talked about, but I think now would be a good time for you to just tell us briefly about Eric and how you guys met, and how some of that has informed your career, really.
Yeah. Well, so I met. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Eric first. Eric is was born legally blind, and he had a degenerative retina disease, so his retina is unraveled, and so he could see some shapes and colors and stuff early on, and then at age 13, he lost all his sight. It went completely black, and so he started rock climbing. For some reason, his dad was a Marine, so he threw his kid in a camp for blind kids, and they threw these blind kids up on a climbing wall, and was like, oh, why not? And so he gravitated towards that, and then the rock climbing turned into mountain climbing, and then we met through a mutual climbing buddy and started climbing early on, and then just sort of forged this friendship. And the friendship was what really was the bedrock of everything that we'd ultimately go do, as things are like this,
Mm-hmm.
And when you do hard things, when you do dangerous things, and when you really have to develop that level of trust, it has to be sort of centered on this idea of friendship and camaraderie and compassion. So, we started to do that. We've been climbing together for 25 years and have attempted a lot of things and come up short on most of them. So, and we've still got lots of things in the hopper. We're still doing a lot of stuff together. We've got a plan for a year from now, actually, next autumn, we're going to be back in Nepal together, attempting a mountain that spit us off back when we used to be young and capable and smart and better looking and all these things. And now we're going to go back to this version of us, and somehow we think it's going to turn out better. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But that's the relationship there. So
I'm going to put you and Eric now in everybody's minds on Everest, and have you just describe to us your concept of the Sherpa attitude and what that means? Yeah.
So, I've done all these expeditions to Nepal and the Himalaya for years and years. And as a result, I've spent a lot of time with the Sherpa community, and obviously, as most folks have heard of the Sherpas before, it's just a matter of, really understanding who they are and what they stand for and how they operate. And, over years, you really learn the selflessness that comes from their approach towards life and work and family, and it's been a real source of learning for me. So this phrase of the Sherpa attitude sort of came from watching them just go out every single day and crush every day. In spite of the danger that's always lurking around another corner, but they're doing it because it's their job, but they also do it because they feel a sense of obligation to help folks, to be there for them when they need them. And so I've just really distilled it down in my mind to this is how they live day to day. And I've seen them on the sides of mountains and also in their homes. And the way they operate is, leading from a place that's centered around, helping other people first. And that's a very refreshing sort of approach, if you ask me. And once again, like I was talking about earlier, it really encompasses all aspects of life. And it doesn't matter if it's on the mountain, it's just how they operate and how we should operate. And so they've really taught me a lot about how to be a selfless leader, how to be a servant leader. And it's helped with my parenting, helped with my being a husband and being a part of my community and all these different parts of operating, because I'm constantly now, because of them, because of what they've taught me, I'm now looking for ways to sort of elevate other people, because when you do that, and it becomes sort of your whole MO, that this really fascinating sort of vapor trail comes out of it. It's people really buy in, and they notice, and it just becomes this infectious sort of attitude. And I'm really grateful for what they've taught me and how it's changed my vision, my optic with things. And I just would encourage people to think like that, because it undoubtedly serves all of us better when we think about others first.
So how can you identify that attitude in other people when you meet them or you work with them? Is that something you think you can identify in a meeting, or do you have to be on a mountain to understand that whether people have these qualities?
Well, being on a mountain is a microscope, right? Mm-hmm. And it also disrobes people. And so that's one of the reasons why I like it. It's one of the reasons why Eric and I started this program for injured vets called No Barriers Warriors, where we take injured veterans on mountains around the world, because it is a form of rehabilitation and reestablishing purpose and fellowship and camaraderie. Because, being in the mountains it's an open playing field, and it strips you down. It may take a few days, but it opens it up, and you're left with who you are, for better or worse. Mm-hmm. So that's why I like that. I like that place. I like the mountains and what they require of all of us. But do I notice it? You bet. I can see that because I'm acutely aware now. I'm looking, and I get the honor of being able to speak to different companies, different industries around the world, and I can tell pretty quick off.
What are those? What are those things? Sorry to interrupt. What are those things that you can see?
Well, it's almost a nebulous sort of vibe. It's a sort of generalization that I get from how people communicate with each other, how the leadership communicates, how they tell people. So oftentimes I'm there like before the meeting starts, and it's sort of how folks communicate right before the meeting, because usually it's a little frantic. You got 500, 1,000, 2,000 people all coming in, and it's like, how does the leader operate in that time when it's a little bit edgy, and how do people respond? More importantly, how do they respond to this person? And I've seen different variations of that, and that's all very eye-opening in my mind. And mostly the big companies that I talk to and communicate with and work with, they do generally have someone in the position that thinks of others first, because otherwise nowadays it would self-implode. And I think it has enough to where there are people organizations have realized that on a cultural level. So, yeah, I am able to sort of sense it in sort of a palpable way, but it's just a matter of the methodology of communication and sort of how the team reacts to the tugs on the rope and the finger pointing. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just making a note. Okay, so thank you for that, and I want to shift gears a little bit, but I also want to put you and Eric back on Everest and talk about the concept of VUCA. So I think you talked about this concept in terms of a specific experience on Everest, but then also your time in Mosul. So help us with what that concept is, and then what it means and how you apply it.
Right. So I've had these experiences which I've alluded to, whether it's guiding Eric up all these mountains and rocks, or flying in a helicopter in the Himalayas doing search and rescue, or being in a combat zone in Mosul. And I came back from that Mosul experience and was just a little bit like disheveled. And fortunately, I've got a lot of military buddies that I talk quite a bit about the experience with, which was, I think, really helpful. And then of course, did my own dive down the Google hole and stumbled upon this acronym that really resonated with me. And it's called VUCA, VUCA. And it was a acronym that was coined by the American War College in late 1980s as a sort of a method to prepare their soon-to-be graduates for for this, volatile, uncertain, chaotic, or complex and ambiguous environment that we all operate in. And so, the VUCA is the acronym, and it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, or chaotic, and then ambiguous. And it all, even though it was initiated by, a tactical, sort of, combat war style school, it's been adopted and embraced by the business community and in my mind, the sort of life coach community, because it really does work if you understand how to be better in the face of these environmental factors, the volatility, the uncertainty of what you're going to face, the complexity of what you're going to face and what we face, and then the ambiguity. And each one of those acronyms, each one of those words, descriptors, sort of allows you to sort of prepare institutionally or personally for how it's sure to be, which is, a junk show, where adversity comes out of nowhere. Landscapes change. Adversity happens. And, some of the real simple takeaways, because it's a very dense topic if you really unpack it.
Yeah.
But the real simple version is just really teaching yourself and those around you to acknowledge, to re-engage, to adapt, to learn, to grow, and to come together in a more cohesive way as things are spinning, sometimes out of control. And then as a leader and as a guide, how critical it is to honestly to be aware that people are watching how you react to these moments of uncertainty or complexity. And folks are watching. Eric was always watching me to gauge my response when things were going sideways. He was watching because how I react, how I went is how he went. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that was a great life lesson for me to remember, as a parent, as a colleague in the emergency department, on the side of the mountain as a guide, hey, people are watching, and I need to be not brushing off the adversity and not walking around with my chest stuck out, cocky, but a quiet confidence that permeates how we do things together cohesively, even in spite of when things are rough and intense. So I think that's probably the 30,000 foot view for the VUCA concept.
Yeah. And it strikes me that this is the concept that might be the origin around after a climb, you get together with your team, whether it's 3 people or more people to debrief on the climb, right? What went well, what didn't go well. I mean, there are times in the book where you have real heart-to-heart conversations about a specific climb. Is that where this came from? That sort of meeting at the end?
Well, no, that what you're talking about there is really what would be considered an AAR in military jargon, an after action report.
Yeah.
And, that's okay, not exactly how we planned it. How can we be better? How can we be better at what we just did? So those AARs were important for us as we started to develop stuff programmatically for the soldiers program, or just after an expedition. How can we be better? What can we do? And that's not a new, fresh concept. I mean, I think people have been doing that, but it's a matter of requiring the team, saying this is part of our mission. And we go out, we prepare for the mission, we execute the mission or the objective, whatever it is, that this group is sharing, this shared objective, and then coming back afterwards as part of the requirement and saying, okay, now it's time to discuss it and to really, pull out the goods and the bad and try and figure out how to be better. So that's an AAR, and yeah, I think it's, you know, part of the whole team dynamic and how we do things. But yes.
And then from a scale perspective, that's your team after a climb. I think you're right that teams do that. Maybe they don't know they're doing it, but they do it. Do you spend a lot of time with your corporate clients talking about that? Hey, this is an important part of the process. Here are some things I've learned about going through the process. And is that a topic for you with your corporate clients?
Yes, because, you know, once again, that's part of it. I love the intellectual side of what I'm doing. And I feel like I've gotten like a crash course in an MBA over the past 17 years, just being involved in industries and learning, you know, the dynamic of guiding. And really that's what it comes down to, is guiding. It's part leadership, but it's also just, it's that team dynamic that is required of all of us as we march through. And so, yeah, I love that part. And so oftentimes after my keynotes, we'll do a structured Q&A or even, you know, I was just with Merck Pharmaceuticals a couple of weeks ago, and, you know, those guys, have these sort of, intense 2-year leadership programs where they're really, grooming their future leaders. And, you know, the keynote was an hour and the Q&A dialogue was 2. So we spent more time, you know, just sort of diving into these things,
right?
And institutionally and culturally and what it means. And yeah, that stuff to me is what really forms us as leaders. And I'm going to say in a selfish way, I learned so much from those opportunities, about these topics that I speak of. I'm continuing to learn. And, I think that's part of that whole restlessness we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think that active learning certainly is there's a restlessness to that. You know, you said you're curious, you know, and you're hungry, and that to me is the hallmark of somebody who loves to learn. Did you have a mentor growing up, or in your life now? Do you have a mentor?
Yeah, I mean, my grandfather was my young mentor, and he, of course, he was very, what didn't have anything to do with outdoor stuff, but he was just a good man, and he helped raise me, and he was an extraordinary fellow, and then once I left, it was I kind of hopped around from different folks who taught me a lot. From the very first group that I landed with when I first moved to Colorado, taught me about climbing and sort of taught me the ropes, you know, literally and figuratively.
Right.
And then I came across a guy named Mark Radlauer early on, who was a doc, and I was a tech in the emergency department, and he was a Tufts Medical School, MIT guy, super smart, but just as nutty as the rest of us. So, he kind of took me under his wing and taught me a lot about medicine and sort of the funny nature of life and how to keep it real. And I think he was a big part of that. And yeah, and then, gosh, over the years, I've really just befriended so many extraordinary men and women who've taught me a lot, and I've just tried to maintain this sort of open ear policy of, asking questions and trying to learn from the people who know a lot more than I do, and just trying to sponge it out, and continue to learn from different folks.
That's great. That's great. Listening to people who know more than you do is important, and the fact that you can identify that and you're not so focused on here's what I have to do, that you're listening is really a great skill to have and an amazing thing to be able to do.
It'll serve you well. And I tell that to my son. It'll serve him well. Just, he doesn't like to listen to his old man. So, okay, don't listen to me, but there's a lot of smart people out there. Listen to them.
Yep. Yeah. I have 2 sons, and both of them we have that exact same conversation. So I'm glad it's not just me. And Glad they listen to others. Yeah. So what advice would you give to people starting their career?
Well, I think if you could distill down everything we've been talking about this whole talk, and you would find my advice, which is, lead from a place of service, right? Like, look to your left and your right. I think that there's a tendency these days to just be looking out for number one and to really just sort of have this sort of blinder attitude on. And I think that's a disservice to yourself and other people. So if you would, sort of take the blinders off and look laterally, I think everyone is served better, and you'll find that it becomes sort of a recipe for how you operate throughout everything you do. And that would be number one. And then number two is and been so critical in my life, is to tie your rope up to people that you trust and that you care about, and that really, where their intentions, you determine through your filtering that their intentions are good and they're right, and how critical that is, because it's easy. And I knew this when I was a teenager and even my early 20s. Just like you link your rope to the wrong people and you pay for it, because you're going to fall. And you don't want to be questioning at that point whether you've put together a good rope team. You want to know that rope's going to catch you, And so, yeah, that's a big part of it. And then being willing to sacrifice and do things that are hard, that have a chance of failure, and be willing to work through those failures. And the idea that success is not final ever, and failure is not fatal, and understanding how those dynamics play out as you move through life, that you're going to experience the highs and the lows. It's a matter of being able to operate when things are high and when things are low. So I think that would probably be the sort of the suits and nuts on what I would encourage folks to do starting out.
Oh, thanks so much for that. I love success is not final and failure is not fatal. I mean, what a great phrase to internalize and think about from time to time, because it definitely can feel the opposite when you're in the throes of it all.
Sure.
So I wish, Jeff, that we had 2 more hours of this. I could sit here and talk to you all day about this stuff. We don't, but I want to thank you for the time that we've had today. I really appreciate your thoughts and the time. It's super meaningful to me and frankly to us, and sharing this with people. I'm just really excited to do that.
Well, thanks. Yeah, you asked a lot of really wonderful questions, and once again, like those questions always get me thinking, and it's good to percolate on things and contemplate. It's easy to become complacent and just kind of walk through, and I think it's harder to do harder things, but in my mind, that's where the value comes out of things, and where we can become the best version of us, and we can become stewards for the other people that we interface with day to day. So yeah, thanks for having me, Jason. Appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, if we can end on one lighter note, because I wanted to talk a little bit about positive pessimism, which is hilarious, by the way. And I was I was out with the Boy Scouts doing some orienteering, and I was in a situation, and in my head popped this phrase, which was, "Well, we're lost, but at least I have a cactus quill stuck in my little toe." So I was thinking about you while we were doing that.
Yeah, it's cold, but at least it's windy, or
right.
And it's like, well, I'm sleeping in a snow cave, but at least I have a hole in my thermarest, and boy, you could keep going. And then Eric's the one with Eric is he's blind, but at least he's slow, so you can use him. You can use him to take a few jabs here and there at your buddies when you want to.
I love it. Obviously, humor plays a role in this as well, so you can't overlook that. But I just wanted to talk about that quickly. Well, thanks again, Jeff. I really, really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you sometime again.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Talent Playbook podcast with our guest, Jeff Evans. You want to learn more about Jeff? Well, you can start at his website, jeffbevans.com. You can find him on Facebook at Jeff B. Evans, Twitter at Jeff_B_Evans. Read his book, Mountain Vision, Lessons Beyond the Summit. And he's got a new podcast with Eric Weinmeier, No Barriers, available where you get your podcasts. I get mine at iTunes. You can subscribe and download this podcast, the Talent Playbook podcast, on iTunes, Google Play Music, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and on the Outmatch.com website in the Now streaming menu. Thanks to Charles Summers and Chris Gardner for the technical assistance. Our theme music is composed by Chris Gardner. Until next time, this is Jason Ferrara saying thanks for listening.